In our reading this morning from 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 18 to chapter 2 verse 5, what we see is the Apostle Paul really challenging what we understand by sound thinking. He was writing to the church in Corinth, a city, as we know, in Greece, and at that time it was a very diverse city. There were different population groups within it, and therefore the different groups had their own different ways of thinking. There were Jewish people there who believed that at the time they believed that getting to God took a great deal of effort. It was something they really had to focus on to make it happen. And in terms of how they visualised God, they visualised him in some ways quite rightly as one of great and infinite strength. But therefore they concluded that whenever God acted, he would act with great, overwhelming strength. So maybe they were looking for the coming of the Messiah, who was going to be some mighty war leader, who was going to come and deliver what they saw as his righteous people by force and overwhelming power. And that was the sort of the logic and the thinking of the Jews. And of course, being Greece, there was a huge Greek population. Their rationale and logic was very different. They were very much reasoning people. They loved to debate. They tried to think, well, does this all add up? Does it make sense? So they're very much based on logic. Both of these worldviews are very different in some ways from the gospel that we remember this morning, when we're going to later in our service come around the table. The gospel that actually, yes, there is a God who's great and all-powerful and almighty, but he came amongst us not with great power, but born as a baby. That he lived amongst us just as we are. And then that he went to a cross and died, taking the penalty for the wrong we've done. He took that punishment. It's a very different worldview. Now, in this passage, to the Greeks, that made no logical sense. To the Jews, it totally overturned their impression of what God is like. One of the problems that I think we all face is no matter what our background, we are trained, we are brought up to a certain way of thinking. Our passage calls that human wisdom. And what it does, if we're not careful, it sort of brings the shutters down on the true things of God, on what God's really like. We don't see it because it goes so against our natural way of thinking. Let me give you an example. The great mathematician Albert Einstein once wrote this. He said, "The word of God is for me nothing more than an expression and product of human weakness. The Bible, a collection of honourable but still primitive legends, which are nevertheless pretty childish. No interpretation, no matter how subtle, can for me change this." Great mathematician, incredibly logical man, but actually there's a flaw in that argument. The flaw in that argument is it rules out any concept that there's a God, that there is a God. And therefore, it's a bit like having a mathematical calculation that's flawed. If you don't put the right, if all the right ingredients aren't there in the first place, the conclusion won't add up correctly. Think about it for a moment. We've all had, well, the world has had over the last 150 years, tremendous progress in terms of scientific knowledge, understanding, in terms of engineering capabilities, and it's transformed the world greatly. That's a reality, that's true, and it's good. But actually think about it, in all that progress, is there still something missing? Are families now happier, more content than they were before? Is our society safer than it was? Have wars ceased? Has hunger, abuse, slavery, suffering, has that all come to an end? Well, of course it hasn't. There is clearly something missing. What's missing is what God has stepped in and done. If we ignore that, well, it's what Paul refers to as human wisdom. And he says that human wisdom is heading to destruction. I love that comment. I mean, think about what he's saying there. If those who are putting across this is all you need, heading to destruction, I wouldn't want to follow them. It'd be a little bit like asking a drowning person to teach you to swim. They can't help. The Christian gospel is the one ingredient that's often missing that makes so much of a difference. Because what the Christian gospel does is it goes to the heart of the problem that many other logics ignore. And that is that there is wrong within us. And the Bible calls it sin. It's what separates us from God. It's what separates us from one another. And what we celebrate this morning as we come around the table is how God stepped in to fill that gap, to make that difference, bringing a different wisdom, God's wisdom, if you like, literally, to the table as we remember this morning. We remember that we couldn't go to God because we'd done wrong and God was holy. So it took God to come to us. He was the only one who could act, so he did act. Contrary to all the expectations of the Jews, he didn't come in mighty power. He came in humility, and he gave himself. And he took the suffering rather than fighting against it. And because of that, we can have a new life. We can be changed. We can be different. Now many people might turn and say, oh no, that is just too simplistic. For our modern and advanced age where we know so much, that is too simplistic. But actually, think about it. Just because something is simple doesn't mean that it's wrong. I found a wonderful illustration of this, and it's an educational researcher went to a group of primary school children and wanted to test, did they know popular sort of sayings, almost like cultural parables that we all know. So they gave them the start and asked them to finish it. Just have a go at some of these. How many do we know? Strike while the iron is hot. Children said, strike while the bug is close. Don't bite the hand that, children said, looks dirty. The pen is mightier than the, children said, pigs. Think about it. The logic there and all of those is correct, just different. Just because something simple doesn't necessarily make it wrong. At the heart of the gospel is the reality that Jesus gives us forgiveness by what he's done. But there's more to the gospel than that. He also gives us a new life, not only in the way of an example to follow, but when we come to him, he changes us. He gives us his spirit that enables us to actually say, that way that I lived, I can break from it. I can be different. He empowers us to do that. That's the power of the gospel. Paul reminds the people of Corinth that human wisdom cannot see that. It's so easily overlooked, neglected. Actually, he calls it foolishness. And the word that he uses for foolishness is the word moria, which is where we get the word moron from. And actually, many people in our society would look at the Christian gospel and that's what they would think about it. And Paul says to the Jewish people, it was a stumbling block. They had this perception of God and they couldn't switch to see the God as he's revealed himself. To the Greeks, it made absolutely no sense. And what I think is really interesting about this passage, and is always important to remember when we come to the epistles, is he was writing to a church. Paul was writing to a church, to people who've come to know this faith, and he was reminding them of it. Why? Because prevailing thinking can so easily affect us and take the shine off the real strength of the gospel. Most of us will have heard of Richard Dawkins, the atheist. Fewer of us might have heard of John Lennox. John Lennox is a leading mathematician. He is an expert on the ethical side of biological research, and he's also a great Christian apologist. He's good at explaining the logic and the rationale of the Christian faith. And the two of them had a debate once, a televised debate. And in that debate, Dawkins said of Lennox, he said this: he believes that the creator of the universe, his God, supposedly, devised the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, the physical constants, who derived the parsecs of space, billions of light years of space, billions of years of time, that this genius of mathematics and physical science could not think of a better way to rid the world of sin than to come to this little speck of cosmic dust and have himself tortured and executed so that he could be forgiven. You know, the world considers the gospel of Christ foolishness. Clearly, the gospel of Christ, in it, God looks weak. It looks like weakness. But actually, it's a demonstration of ultimate strength. God, when he came to earth, when he lived amongst us, when he died for us, achieved something that no human being could ever do. He achieved the impossible. He made it possible for us to come to God. He handled the whole root of the problem, which isn't solved, hasn't been solved by all our advancements over the last 150 years. The Apostle Paul was himself an incredible intellectual for his day. He understood this. I like the way that C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia books, again, a leading intellectual of his day, he wrote this: one of the reasons I believe Christianity one of the reasons I believe in Christianity is the fact that it is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered just the kind of universe we'd always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But in fact, it's not that sort of thing anyone would have made up. It is just that queer twist that real things have. Nobody would make up the gospel. It would have come as an astonishing thing. It did come as an astonishing thing. It was God revealing himself to us. How is this wisdom of God revealed today? Well, it's actually revealed in the lives of believers, of people who come, people who try it, people who find it's true, people who it makes a real difference in their lives. Just think about it for a moment. Supposing somebody harms us in whatever way, what's our natural instinctive reaction? To strike back, isn't it? To get our own back. How is it the Christian believer, suffering that same loss, thinks, actually, yeah, God could have done that to me, but he didn't. He took the penalty for me. He gave me forgiveness. The Christian believer thinks, that's an example to follow. If God can forgive me, I can forgive. Where does that come from? It's the power of the cross. Think about one of our young people. They're upstairs at the moment in their own groups. They go to school. They want to be fit in with the class. They want to be popular. Peer pressure is great. But the kids they're with, they're getting up to no good. And therefore they face a dilemma. Should I go along with them? After all, I could hide it from my parents. They wouldn't need to know. And get away with it. Or do they stand back and they say, actually, I don't need to be popular there. I'm popular with God. I'm going to follow his way and make a difference. So they take the risk and stand out. Why do they do it against such great pressure? It's the power of the cross. Or think about an elderly person who's ill and is taken into hospital. They're going to have a procedure and then they're going to looking forward to going home when the doctor comes to them and says, I'm sorry, this is terminal and I'm afraid it's going to be quick. That person could sink into despair, to sink into real sorrow and hopelessness, even get angry. But no, they think, I know who I trust. I know where I'm going. I have a hope. Where does that hope come from? It's the power of the cross. And that's what makes the difference. And that's why Paul in our passage said to the Christian believer, that church that he planted some years before, as he's writing to them, he said, when I came to you, I didn't come with lofty speech. I didn't come with clever ways of explaining it. Why didn't he have to do that? He simply focused on Christ, on what Christ had done, on how he had experienced it. And that could be seen. And what I really like about this passage is it carries in it a great encouragement to all those of us who are Christian believers who so often think to ourselves, I couldn't share the gospel. Why would anybody listen to me? Most of us probably feel like that at times, don't we? You know, how many of us, when we were at school in the days before teachers became sort of more sensitive to the feelings of pupils? Do you remember doing games? And how did the teacher split the class into two teams? Do you remember how they used to pick on the two most athletic pupils and they called them out to be captains? And then each of these newly appointed captains would pick their team and they would pick the next most athletic person, and the other one's turn and they pick the next most athletic person. And if you were like me, you were stood in that line and that one went and that one went and that. Before you knew it, the line was looking a bit thin. Yeah. I think many of us really feel like that when it comes to sharing the gospel. Why would anybody listen to us? Because of the change Christ has made in our life. Because when we come to him, we receive forgiveness. That gives us a confidence. We enter a relationship with God that's real. He gives us his Spirit, who slowly changes us and helps us to understand, so that we live differently, so that we don't need great explanations. We don't need to be the most educated to explain how it could possibly be. All they have to do is to look at our lives. That is the power of the cross. Let's focus on that power. I thought it would be helpful this morning as we do that. We're going to sing two songs as we normally do. The first one is one that we normally sing at Easter, but I don't see why we shouldn't sing it now. It is the power of the cross. It reminds us in detail of what Christ did. And then we'll go on to sing the song as we approach the table, Who Am I? Let's stand and worship together.